Hello friends, welcome to my channel Katha Manthan. Today I am going to tell you an ICSE story, B. Wordsworth, written by V.S.Naipaul. Introduction of the story. B. Wordsworth has been taken from Naipaul's novel McGill Street. It is about an unsuccessful poet B. Wordsworth and his friend a boy, whom he calls Sonny, out of affection. Initially, he came to watch bees in the boy's house, and gradually both get befriended with each other. Both of them begin to spend time together. Once a poet takes the boy to his residence with a yard filled to various trees such as mangoes, etc. Both relish on mangoes there. The poet tells the boy his own love story, as though indirectly, and a great poem he is working on. However, at the time of his death, he disowns both his love story and the great poem, fearing that otherwise the boy may follow him and suffer. Some critics may say that he was vagrant. His death came to the boy as shock. A year later on, during stroll on that street, the boy finds the house is nowhere to be seen. Though his story, Naipaul wants to convey that poetry has no value in the present day, materialistic world and is certainly not a medium of sustenance. Poetry is termed as a bad profession. Sir Naipaul also conveys the stark reality that the good old natural settings are fast disappearing in urban areas. The plot. Sonny, the boy, gets a visitor in his house. The visitor introduces himself as a poet. Friendship begins between the poet and Sonny, the boy. Middle. The boy is taken to his house by the poet. Both eat mangoes there. A love story is told by the poet. Ending. The poet gets old. Before dying, he tells the boy that everything he has told him about his love and poetry is untrue. The boy is shocked. After a gap of 1 year, the boy finds the poet's house nowhere. A successful plot display cohesive and continuous sequence of beginning, middle and ending. The beginning is such a mid as to rouse readers' interest in the things to come. The story B. Wordsworth begins with reference to the visit of a stranger to a boy's house and names of the boy Sonny out of affection. The stranger describes purpose of his visit as bee watching, which arouses readers' interest in the men. The friendship which develops between the stranger and Sonny reveals quite a few things about both of them. The stranger appears to be a singer and a poet. He possesses all the qualities of a poet and declares the renowned poet William Wordsworth as his brother. The stranger says that he believes the boy having poetical abilities. At the middle of the plot, the boy is taken to his home by the men, and then the man tells him a true story of love between a boy and a girl, which somehow appears to be the story of a man himself. The man also tells at the middle of the plot, the boy is taken to his home by the men, and then the man tells him a story of love between a boy and a girl, which somehow appears to be the story of the man himself. The man also tells the boy that he is working on a poem destined to be one of the greatest in the world. At the finishing landing portion, the plot gives out anticlimax. The boy pays a second visit to the poet's house, only to find his friend weaker, older and almost dying. Now the poet tells the boy that whatever he told him before about the love affair and about the great poem are all untrue. This shocks the boy. The poet breathes his last and the boy runs back home crying. The story further begins. The story ends with the information that after 1 year, while strolling across the same street, the boy discovers that the deceased poet's house has disappeared and the trees are pulled down. The world of nature has been replaced by another jungle of brick, mortar, and concrete. This unexpected but inevitable reversal is shocking to the boy, who's seen the poet's death and disappearance of his green world as that of an era with which Wordsworth is associated. Theme of the story: poetry as a profession. Through all the happenings, incident, and ultimate fate of the poet B. Black Wordsworth, the writer emphasizes that poetry as a profession is unremunerative. This is why the boy's mother gave him a sharp retort when he asked her if he could buy poetry for 4 cents. Tell the blasted man to howl his tail away from my yard. In such a situation, the poet can do little to survive. B. Wordsworth attends to Calypso's singing to earn some money. He is working on an ambitious poem which will give him money and fame. He himself tells the boy later he takes a U-turn on nearing death and tells the boy that his story above a love as well as the preparations for an ambitious poetry are all fake. The readers feel that did such in order to dissuade the boy from the unremunerative path of poetry, the death of an old era. The story upholds old values such as love, devotion, honesty, sensibility, and so on, which are fast disappearing in this modern materialistic world. Whether or not B. Wordsworth and poets and boy Sony are genius poets, they certainly are endowed with poetic temperament. Both of them are sensitive and sentimental. The poet in particular takes immense in observing unusual things like bees, centipedes, scorpions, etc. He is also stargazer. Sony, the boy, having identical temperament, imitates the poet. The poet indirectly tells him his own love story but retracts later on. The death of the poet comes as a rude shock to the boy, who feels that the poet's death is the death of his own poetic world. Exactly a year later, while strolling on that road, the boy finds that the old house of the deceased poet is gone, being replaced by a modern house with bricks, mortars, and concrete, replacing fruit trees and wild green. Indirectly, this indicates the end of an era in which people love nature and uphold old human values, true to the Wordsworthian spirit. Summary of the story: B. Black Wordsworth visits the boy's home. The narrator recalls how 3 vagabonds used to knock at all hospitable doors on McGill Street. His own house also obliged him with tidbits. One day a stranger arrived. He called the boy Sony and asked if he could come into the yard to watch bees. He was neatly dressed and conversed in very good English. The boy's mother grudgingly let him in. The man introduced himself as a great poet and fond of bees, centipedes, and scorpions. He wanted to sell a poem for 4 cents, but the boy's mother rudely dismissed his idea. The stranger then departs for the day. The boy Sony visits the poet's house. As the stranger left, Sony prayed that he would see him again. The boy's wish was perhaps heard, and he met the poet at a street corner after a week's time. The poet invited the boy to his house and entertained him with ripe mangoes from trees of his yard. The boy looked the poet one room but very interesting with a mango and a palm tree in the yard. In the process of devouring mangoes, the boy got his shirt stained and was rebuked and beaten by his annoyed mother. The boy lost his temper and rushed out of the house, swearing that he would never come again. Sony's outing with B. Wordsworth. With bleeding from his nose and himself crying, the boy rushed into poet's house. B. Wordsworth started consoling him and took him out for a walk. As suggested by the poet, they lay on the grass and began to gaze to stars overhead. The poet started acquainting with him about the names of the star and constellations. Sony was fascinated with the constellation of Orion and remembered it lifelong. Then a policeman arrived on the spot and inquired as to what they were doing. The poet said he had no answer. A tragic love story. Both became fast friends. The boy, true to his age, asked frequent questions. One day he asked the poet why there were so much bushes in the garden. The poet started telling him a story which apparently was his own. A boy and a girl, both poets, met, fell in love and married. The girl got pregnant. Unfortunately, the girl died with a fetus in her womb. Her husband felt very sad and did not touch anything in the girl's garden. Bushes and wilderness engulfed the garden in course of time. As the poet was telling the story, he seemed to be growing older. B. Wordsworth's ambitious project. The poet was confident in Sony that he was writing the greatest poem in the world. He said he is working on it for 5 years or so, and that he intended to finish it with next 25 years, writing one line in a month. His poem would sting to call humanity, the poet remarked. Worsening condition of the poet. One day the boy asked the poet about his means of sustenance. The poet disclosed that he sang calypsos, which were Caribbean songs on contemporary issues, for some time of the year. One day, when the boy came to meet him in the poet's house, he found him very sick, and his worsening condition made the boy cry. The poet just remarked that poem was not going well. He was not looking at the boy, and the boy could see death in his face. B. Wordsworth heaved his last. The poet looked at the boy and called him near. As the boy sat on his knees, the poet said, "Oh, you can see it too. I always knew you had the poet's eyes." The boy burst out crying loudly. The poet drew him by his chain of his thin chest and made a shocking confession. He told the boy that the love story he had told the boy was not true at all. Even his talk about poetry and the greatest poem in the world was untrue. He then asked the boy to go home and never ever return to his house. Shell-shocked, the boy stood struck dumb. The poet heaved his last, and the boy ran home crying like a poet. Unwelcome change in the scene. A year after, the boy was walking along Alberto Street when the poet had lived. There was no sign of the poet's house and the surrounding wilderness. A new 2-story building had come up and all trees were cut up. There was brick and concrete all around, as if B. Wordsworth never existed. Setting. The story is set in contemporary times as Trinidad. The setting here is important as it explains why characters behave in a particular manner and how they are influenced by history, politics and culture. Trinidad had composite culture with native blacks lying side by side with the whites who had been previously ruling over them. Most of those black people natives were illiterate, uncouth and rough. They speak accented and broken English. The poet B. Wordsworth, who is tightly dressed and speaks flawless as well as fluent English, immediately arouses suspicion and anxiety in mother's mind. The very atmosphere is very much unpoetic, rather highly prosaic and materialistic. Persons like B. Wordsworth, who watches nature and spends time in useless and wasteful pursuits, are resented by people. Naturally is first replaced a jungle of bricks, mortar and concrete. That is a big 2-story house with all the trees cut and removed, the fast phase of the development in the urban localities. Trinidad is obliquely referred to as a big threat to old world and peace and contentment. Thank you friends. Thank you for watching my channel Katha Manthan. For question answers and more reference, please visit our website www.kathamanthan.com. Thank you.